Rick's Recaps welcome you to a survival thriller film, Open Water to Adrift. It involves a bunch of friends on a yacht. Soon they get excited and jump in the ocean without lowering the ladder, leaving an infant inside. A while later, they realize they can't climb up and panic. As the situation becomes more intense, a guy accidentally stabs his friend who can't make it. At night, thunderstorm worsens it. With water levels rising, another harrowing situation looms ahead. Stay with the video as we delve deeper. The story follows a group of best friends who travel, have fun, and film their adventures. A tipsy Dan spins around with his camera, loses balance, and falls off a cliff but escapes with minor bruises. 5 years later, Amy, her husband James, and their daughter Sarah visit Mexico City to celebrate Zach's 30th birthday on Dan's new yacht. On the way, Zach and Lauren pass them on a motorcycle. The group reunites at the yacht club. Amy, the only one wearing a life jacket, cautiously approaches the yacht, haunted by hydrophobia since her father's drowning. With her husband's support, she conquers her fear and boards. Inside, the friends find Dan with his latest girlfriend, Michelle. They set sail, and Zach and Lauren question Dan about affording the yacht, but he laughs it off. Later, Amy and James tuck their daughter into bed, leaving a walkie-talkie to monitor her. The party is in full swing as the friends drink, dance, and have fun. Michelle suggests a swim, and they eagerly dive in, while Amy stays aboard with Dan to check on baby Sarah. Dan admits to Amy he wants kids and regrets his past behavior, but she, happy with her husband, ends the awkward talk and suggests he return to the deck. In the water, Zach retrieves a seashell for Lauren, and Michelle flirts with James. Meanwhile, Amy confides in Dan her fear of passing her phobia onto Sarah. In a playful moment, Dan grabs Amy and, ignoring her frantic protests, jumps into the water with her. Panic sets in as she relives the traumatic flashbacks of her father's death. The friends try to calm her, but their voices seem distant. Suddenly, they realize Dan forgot to lower the ladder before jumping. Little Sarah's left alone on the boat. James hums a lullaby to calm Amy, while the others struggle to climb aboard, but the boat's sides are too high. Michelle, cold and exhausted, clings to an inflatable dolphin. Dan asks to use it to climb up, but the slippery toy deflates under his weight. Spotting a flag on the stern, Dan grabs it after several tries, but it proves too unstable to support him. Amy regains her composure, and the group pauses to think of a solution. Michelle panics, convinced a shark is beneath them. Dan dives to check but finds nothing, though they know predators may come soon. Frustrated, everyone blames Dan for the situation. He admits his mistake but feels helpless. Tearfully, Amy insists they must act quickly, as Sarah is alone on the boat. Exhausted, Michelle begins to drown and grabs at Amy's life jacket. The group pulls her away as she spirals into a breakdown. Lauren lays Michelle on her back, calming her with a prayer. Under the blazing sun, the group grows exhausted and thirsty. Suddenly, they hear a phone ringing near the boat. It's in Zach's dangling jacket. Dan throws it down, and Zach answers, but the soaked phone cuts out before they can say anything. In frustration, Michelle grabs the phone, dropping it into the water and losing their chance to reconnect. Dan proposes a rescue plan: tie their belongings into a rope to throw on board. Just then, a boat speeds past, but despite their desperate signals, the passengers merely wave and continue. Left with no choice, they follow Dan's idea. Using a knife from Zach's jacket, they cut their clothes into strips and fashion a rope. James asks if the boat can be accessed from below, but Dan isn't sure. Taking the knife, James dives to check. Meanwhile, the group throws the makeshift rope on board, but when Zach tries to climb, it snaps, sending him back into the water. James's attempt also ends in failure. During another dive, James loses the knife and swims too deep to retrieve it, hitting the bottom of the boat while rising. As James emerges, Lauren inspects him and notices blood from his ear, signaling a head injury that requires immediate medical attention. This pushes Zach to take more drastic measures. He grabs James's knife and begins punching through the side of the boat to climb aboard. In a panic, Dan tries to stop him, not wanting the boat damaged, but in the struggle, Dan accidentally stabs Zach in the stomach. The situation spirals out of control as Sarah's cries come through the radio. She's awake and frantic, unable to find her parents. Zach's condition worsens, and he slowly dies from his wound. Michelle, exhausted, drifts away from the group and succumbs to the water. Dan tries to save her but realizes it's too late. Grunting, Zach makes a final joke, recalling their trip 5 years ago, and wishing Dan had brought a camera this time. His last memory is of Lauren, remembering her beauty. With those words, he falls limp in her arms, and she breaks down in hysterical sobs. James's nerves snap, and he lashes out at Dan, accusing him of caring more about the boat than his friends' lives. Amy tries to calm him, but he's even angrier that she's defending her former lover. James's outburst makes him start vomiting. Dan admits he lied about the yacht and his finances. He borrowed the yacht from his boss, who he works for as an errand boy. He pretended to own it to impress women like Michelle and boast about a life he never had. He didn't want the knife marks on the boat because he was hiding the truth, and now his best friend is dead. Overcome with guilt, Dan begins to cry. Lauren reveals she was in love with Zach but never told him. Amy gently convinces her to let go of his body. Hours pass, and the group remains adrift, exhausted, each reflecting on moments from their lives. James's condition worsens, and he begins ranting. Unable to stay still, Lauren bids her friends farewell and swims away, hoping to reach shore and call for help. Meanwhile, little Sarah continues crying. Amy tries to calm her through the radio, but nothing works. Recalling Zach's plan to use a knife to climb aboard, Amy prepares to dive in search of it, but Dan stops her, diving in himself to try and make things right. As darkness falls, Amy is left alone with James, who intermittently passes out, complaining of exhaustion and a headache. Rain begins to fall, and James quietly passes away. Amy, overcome with grief, screams in agony. Dan hears her but keeps diving, determined to find the knife and save them. As night falls, Amy finally accepts her husband's death and releases his body. Saying goodbye, she hums the lullaby they once sang to their daughter. Dan surfaces, screaming in pain from a cramped arm, and Amy shares her life vest to help him swim back to the boat. Meanwhile, the storm intensifies, making survival seem almost impossible. Feeling helpless, Dan slams his goggles into the boat's stern, shattering them. Left with only the glass, he uses it to wedge between the board and the gangway, gripping it with his hand. He calls to Amy, who attempts to climb aboard, using Dan's hand as a foothold. She struggles to grab the board, but the rain makes her hand slip, and she falls back into the water. Dan urges her not to give up. Amy climbs onto his shoulders and tries again, but Dan grits his teeth, enduring the pain as she steps on his arm. When she slips once more, Amy summons her last strength, finally reaching the deck and pulling herself up. Overcome with emotion, Dan laughs and shouts in joy. Amy lowers the gangway and rushes to the cabin to comfort her crying daughter. Dan clings to the gangway but pauses, torn between following Amy and saving himself or accepting responsibility for the tragedy. Holding Sarah, Amy calms her daughter and lies beside her, relieved that the nightmare is over. But soon she realizes Dan hasn't come aboard. Stepping onto the deck, she spots his life jacket floating in the water, and in the distance, his lifeless figure. She tries to shout and reach the jacket, but knows it's too late. Her guilt has led Dan to make the painful choice to end his life. Amy is reminded of the way her father drowned before her eyes when she was a child. Determined to prevent another tragedy, Amy conquers her phobia and swims after Dan. As he sinks, she tries to pull him up, the scene flashing back to her childhood when she tried to save her father. Morning arrives and a fishing boat approaches the yacht. The fisherman sails around the empty boat, calling out but receiving no response before sailing away. Sarah wakes up in the cabin and begins crying. The story ends with Amy standing on deck, gazing into the distance. Dan lies unconscious at her feet, whom she managed to save. The fishing boat has vanished, and the engine hums faintly in the distance. Amy has survived and can finally return home.